Let me take a moment to introduce myself. My name is Sarah Brown. This is my sign name and S and an H on your chest. I'll be moderating today's panel for you, and I am thrilled for you to meet our panelists. I have been interpreting for over 25 years. Oh my goodness. But these past 3 years, I've been working at NDC National Deaf Center as the Access Coordinator. So now we are ready to invite our panelists on the screen. Please join me. Hello, and welcome everyone to today's panel. I'm so happy you're here with us today. So for us to go ahead and get started, I'd love for you all to introduce yourselves. It can just be pretty brief. Your name and maybe one sentence about you, maybe how you are affiliated with interpreting and this topic specifically, your organization or your agency. We'll go ahead and start with Julia today.
Folks, hi. I'm Julia Kennedy, and this is my sign name. And I'm a deaf student at Hampton University, HSU. And I'm a visiting student at Gallaudet University at the moment, but I use interpreters all the time for the classes I'm in.
Great, thank you, Julia. Wonderful, thanks. So next we have for you today, let's see, Alicia, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I wanted to first thank the National Deaf Center for inviting me, and to my fellow panelists for having giving me the opportunity to speak alongside. My name is Alicia Booth, and I'm the founder of Designated Interpreters, and this topic is very near and dear to my heart, so I'm excited to share a little bit about our history and what we're doing now.
Awesome, thank you. And now we have Jermaine.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jermaine Williams. My sign name is like this. And I work in Dallas, well, here in Dallas, Texas. The name of the organization I work for is DAC, Deaf Action Center. It is a deaf-owned, deaf-run business founded to serve both the Dallas and Fort Worth area. And we're expanding our lens to the overall state of Texas. And what I do there is I am a scheduler. I schedule ASL and CART services for our deaf and hard of hearing community, especially for the deaf and hard of hearing college students as well. Yeah, that's who I am.
Wonderful. Well, I'm thrilled to have you all, and I know that our attendees today are super excited to dig in and learn from all of you and your experiences. But first, to help our panel know who's here with us today and who's joined us as the audience, we will have our first poll question. Fantastic. That should be up on your screen now. We have one question on your screen now for you available for you to answer. And that question is, what's your role? What is your primary position? There are a few options for you to choose from. Are you a scheduler of interpreting services? Are you a disability services professional? Maybe at a college or a university. Another option is an educator. You may be an interpreter, a parent, or finally, you can choose student. Maybe you find yourself falling in a handful of categories. I say go ahead and pick your primary role in terms of this topic of interpreting with us today. Very good. Here are your results. You all can see them on your screen. It looks like we have mostly interpreters with us today. 32% of our audience is interpreters. But schedulers, we've got 18%. And then we also have 23% of disability services professionals, 11% of educators. We don't have any parents with us today, which is totally fine. But we have 16% students. That's fantastic. You will learn today how to advocate for yourselves. So this is great. Thank you. All right, so our first question for the panelists today, we want to know some success stories that you may have, some experiences that you could share. Let me find it here. I've got it populated beside me on my screen. Anytime maybe that you've partnered with a deaf person and it's really been a good success, maybe where the schedules really worked out well with classes, or a student, maybe anytime you really felt like they heard you, they listened to you, and they followed your wishes and respected that, and it went really well. Sue, who's up first? Who'd like to respond to our first question today? Anyone?
This is Julia speaking. I'll go ahead and respond to that. As a college student, I've had a great experience with interpreters. And I do have some good stories with the interpreter coordinator that I've worked with. I would make sure that I have a qualified interpreter for my classes. And also, I always tell my interpreters, coordinators, that I'd rather have a consistent interpreter throughout the class. I don't want a switching of interpreters or having a rotation of interpreters. That's not my preference. And the coordinator so far has believed in me and complied with my wishes, and that has worked out well.
You know, that's really great. And I think it's definitely important to continue to relay that. Consistent interpreters are very important for you. And in fact, that'll come up later in the panel. I'm glad that that was been so good for you. Alicia, did I notice your hand as well? Would you like to comment as well?
Yeah, so the stories and the insight that I'll share today may be a little bit of a different perspective coming from healthcare sciences, working in the hospitals with medical students, doing their training, as well as residency throughout hospital training as well. So I would say our success have been many because we follow the designated interpreter model, in which we give full empowerment to our clients, the deaf students, their choices of working with their preferred interpreters. We have a matching system, which we might get into a little bit later, and how we partnership in that approach. But our success stories are often around the model that we use, which is prepared to be unprepared. Are we okay? Okay. Prepared to be unprepared, because in medicine, it's always constantly changing. So for example, we might show up for a lecture that was going to be on a thoracotomy, and they might switch presenters last minute and do something on sickle cell anemia. And what that means to us, the success that we can still have in those moments, is the continuity with that client, being exposed to that environment all the time, and allowing ourselves to be fully present and available, and continue our self-study along with the client as they continue their self-study, as a whole team approach. So it's all about making lots of preparations and being prepared to drop that preparation and still keeping your cool and professionalism in the moment. Another story that I like to share is when we were working in a VA hospital with a orthopedic surgeon, and there was always one day a week that we would do clinical instead of in the operating room. So, you know, I prepared to be unprepared, and I had my snack and my phone charger and papers and everything to take notes. And I always brought a change of OR clothes. For whatever reason that day, I didn't do that. And of course, last minute surgery showed up, and we had to go to surgery. And I ended up doing the surgery for 6 hours in dress heels with my OR booties over top. And you know what, it worked out, because I knew there's always a chance that things would change. We still got the job done, and as a team, we made it work.
Wow, 6 hours is a long time for heels and in a cold OR. Goodness. What a story. But I think your role is so critical. We're seeing more and more deaf people engaging in the healthcare and medical field. And so I love to see that it's becoming so very popular, and the organizations are modeling and developing models based on what you just talked about. Now, Jermaine, you may have some success stories, and maybe either or both sides, as a former student or also now as a schedule in your current role. So, can you think of something that's worked well for you in either of your situations?
Actually, yes, I have several hats I wear, uh, along with being a coordinator. I work for an exemplary organization, Deaf Action Center, which includes an interpreting department. My roles are varied. Interpreting, I would say, we have over 50 independent contractor interpreters registered with us. So I'd say I'm constantly working on a schedule and getting that organized, especially in the academic area. One thing that I really love about our interpreting community is that they're true advocates for DIs and for CDI. When an interpreter feels that that is required for the situation, they promptly make that call and they send us a message. So what I do with that information is, of course, to focus on the next barrier, which is the fact that we only have 2 CDIs, certified CDIs, here in the Fort Worth, Dallas area. So we're constantly reaching out and working with interpreters. And so I focus with having CDIs work with deaf youth first. Since they are our future, I would like them to get the benefit of their services. Another thing I love about the interpreting community here, both hearing and deaf interpreters, is that they're really supportive of each other. For example, a success story that I have is one where 2 or 3 deaf students, not having limited language, but instantly you can tell that they are much more iconic in their signing style, and they all needed either a CDI or a DI. So of course, with school starting soon and me receiving a last minute request, that area where interpreters are very supportive of each other, I love where that comes in because our department functions the same way. So we're able to provide that support, move schedules around, make sure that slots get filled. And something that's really cool is there's a person at the school I'm talking about in particular, the disability services coordinator. That person happens to be a child of deaf adults. So of course, she centers the deaf youth first and empowers them and listens to their recommendations or suggestions first as a priority. So I'm the interpreter department manager, working with the disability services coordinator and the interpreters. We really are supportive through negative or positive situations, and we come together to provide ideas. And it's proof that situations can be worked out. And so that's a successful story I have where I've been able to provide a wonderful team and been in a wonderful team environment. Now switching hats and switching roles, and I'm sorry if that might have been a long response. From a student perspective, I've gone to a college as the only deaf individual where I've had to constantly advocate for myself for qualified or certified interpreters. Just like what Julia mentioned, I completely understand that, live it and breathe it. I've attended college for more than 10 years, I'd say. And it's the same school, familiar with the folks there, the staff, and the location. So I've reached out to that disability services coordinator, indicating that there's a little bit of disappointment with the quality of interpreters I'm receiving. And I'm not able to pay attention to the class because of it. And so I've asked, hey, and hinted, there's an agency nearby that can help. That coordinator has finally been willing to take my recommendation and schedule a qualified, certified interpreter because I am taking legal courses. The staff interpreters that they have at that college I'm not sure if they're familiar with the terminology in that class. They aren't always. So an interpreter that they brought in was from another agency that satisfied my needs. And they've been a consistent interpreter. I haven't had them replaced throughout the class. That really showed me that those interpreters had a commitment to understanding the content of the class in order to make sure that I understand the class. And they've empowered me to advocate more for myself. And, I was 30, 31 at the time. I'm 35 now. But regardless of age, I have to constantly advocate for myself because I learn something new every day while I'm advocating for myself as well. So there you have 2 success stories from each role.
That's fantastic. Wow. Yeah, Julia?
Sure, I'd like to add something. I want to add that I'm the only deaf student at my university, Hampton University. So there are a lot of challenges and there are a lot of barriers, but I'm making it through the years. As the years go by, I not only am a deaf student there, but I'm also a student with a disability. So I need to have interpreters who understand my signing style. And I want to make sure that I get interpreters where the interpreters actually understand my signing style. And if they don't or aren't able to understand my signing style, then I would go ahead and ask the interpreter coordinator to go ahead and replace those interpreters with someone else, someone who is able to understand me and my signing style. So.
Absolutely. Wow. Yeah, Jermaine?
I can add something similar to what Julia just mentioned. Maybe right, maybe wrong, I'm not really sure. But when it comes to qualified interpreters, they have to be able to code switch. They have to have a range. They just have to. Especially with people who identify as Black or Indigenous or people of color. Especially someone from the South, because in the South, there are 3 grassroots organizations. There's Black ASL, then there's Standard ASL. So I and Julia, I'm sure we've both had the experience where we get exhausted from having to code switch ourselves instead of the interpreter doing that, where we're constantly back and forth between languages. I always request interpreter services. When I make my request from interpreter services, I always request someone that can code switch. I don't want someone that's a very pictorial ASL signer or someone who's a very English signer. I want someone that could swing the range and swing that pendulum on both sides. When it comes to deaf and hard of hearing youth, the goal is to empower themselves. And so you need someone, an interpreter that can code switch, and they can do that themselves too. But I'd rather the interpreter take on that labor of doing all the code switching.
Yes, and to your point, Jermaine, it may be good. And Julia, you may want to add something to that. You mentioned it to me just the other day about the importance of an interpreter who knows your culture as a Black woman, as a Black person. And so would you like to add to that? Because I know Jermaine just touched on that and in that same vein. So would you like to add to that?
Sure. My school, where I attend, is a historically Black college and university. So most of the time, I do have white interpreters in the class with me, and I'm fine with that. I'm completely fine with having a white interpreter, of course. But the issue comes in when they can't really interpret my voice as a Black female. Like, let's say I want to say girl, or let's say I want to say baby, and the interpreter might have got that wrong. The interpreters might not be able to interpret what I'm saying, or they might not be able to understand my issues as a Black person living in America. And I've noticed that my hearing friends or peers, they actually act a little bit different when I'm accompanied by a white interpreter. I can tell that they're a little bit put off and not completely comfortable when they're talking to me through that interpreter. And I've noticed that when there's a Black interpreter present, then they really feel at home. They feel like we understand our issues, or they understand my issues of being Black in America. So sometimes you just have to bring in a POC interpreter, person of color interpreter. For example, if it's a concert or something, music, and there are Black musicians, for a situation like that, you would want to, of course, bring in a Black interpreter. When a white interpreter sees a job when it has to do with music, then a white interpreter should ask details on what type of music that is, because it might be a better fit for a Black interpreter. And so as an interpreter, you need to ask yourself whether or not you're a good fit for that genre of music. It might not be a job that's for you, and it might be a job that you have to decline and have that job offered to another interpreter who is familiar with that type of music or that genre of music.
Absolutely. You know, and I've noticed myself, there's kind of a theme too for, you know, the importance for interpreters ourselves to know when we are not a good fit. And very often it might be ego, might be pride that gets in the way, or just feeling like, well, but I can do it. I'm skilled. I'm good at music. But we have to take a bunch of steps back and see, you know, what is the deaf person's preference? What's best for them? We are not the best fit for everybody. I've been in that situation myself when, I was younger. I showed up, I didn't know much better. And I got in that space and realized culturally, I am missing so many things, jokes, people teasing and just kind of going off or whatever. And I just didn't understand. That's not equitable for the deaf person if I am the one lacking. And so me as the interpreter, I needed to realize, and we impact the dynamic. You all just mentioned, like in the class and the environment, we impact and influence what's happening. So if you show up, we can show up and realize maybe, we need to find an interpreter who's the better fit. And that is incumbent on us as the white hearing interpreter in that space, because we're the ones who typically get called to do those type of assignments. And it's on us to call on other interpreters to come on and come and do these assignments and really have us think beyond ourselves. It's just so important. So thank you all for sharing your stories. Oh my gosh, I could literally watch all day. Fortunately, we have a couple more questions though. But first, I'm going to have the poll question come up on the screen for the audience. And let's take a look at this one. So here's the second poll question. I have it populated behind me as well. We've been talking about preferred interpreters a little bit. So the question for you is, does your school listen and follow that? Yes or no? Will they consider a preferred interpreter request? All right, there's the poll question. If you all wouldn't mind going ahead and answering that for us. Fantastic. All right, well, I'll tell you what, I'm happy to see 52% of yeses coming across the screen, but that also means the drawback is almost half of you have a potential no, or sometimes an answer to that particular question. All right, so seeing that, our next question for you panelists is, now we've already discussed it a little bit, but success stories we talked about. So maybe now, if you'd be willing to share with us your experience navigating preferred interpreters. Now, Alicia, you mentioned the model that you follow. You also mentioned successes in that space. And then each of you, Julia and Jermaine, mentioned a success of getting your preferred interpreter. So what have you seen that may help the audience? Like, how can they advocate for that? Is it about the language? What would you say that would need to be said to those coordinators to get that happening? All right, Alicia.
Well, first of all, I guess I would say that how we work is that many clients seek us, so medical students or residents, and let's say they've just started a program and it's brand new for that program to have ever worked with a deaf student, very common, and they don't know anything about interpreting, and that student may be struggling with getting the appropriate services. Much like Jermaine and Julia mentioned, it's a tiered approach of the disability support, the deaf individual, and the school itself, and the direct service provider, the interpreter. But since it is new often for programs, they may be resistant to providing interpreting at all, let alone designated interpreting. So our agency very often gets requests directly from the deaf individual asking for help and support and advocacy. So the schools that I interface with, we sort of start from ground zero and do some outreach and education and share with them, first of all, how deaf individuals are not one size fit all, explain to them the cultural values and their distinct language needs. Then we share a little bit about interpreter training and how it would be inappropriate to pull an interpreter that has primarily worked in, let's say, K through 12, and put them in a high academic situation, not to mention in a high critical, high stakes demand hospital situation. And we do that education sometimes by reflecting back to the individuals, the work that they're doing. So making some analogies, if you were a pediatric doctor, for example, you would certainly not want to do brain surgery, and that sounds a little bit extreme, but when we're talking about access to equitable education, we need interpreters that can match that demand and that need. So designated interpreting for us is very much a partnership approach. It involves the deaf individual and first understanding what their needs are. Many of our clients, to be honest, may be brand new to using interpreting services at all. We have found that many hard of hearing individuals maybe have been raised in an oral environment and little exposure to sign language, but they get to this level in their career where the demands are too high and now they need support. So we look at that process together. We give 100% empowerment to their preferred choice of interpreter. But I will say it's a partnership approach because sometimes it's new to the deaf individual to know how to select an interpreter. They don't necessarily have the linguistic training or understand the varied backgrounds of interpreters. And so what we do is we do the interview process together to find an interpreter, and certainly a personality match is really important in our scenarios because sometimes we might work 12-hour shifts together or work through the night together, and you certainly don't want to be matched up with someone that just kind of grades on you all day. Let's face it, there's a human element to that. But at the same time, we need to be careful that that designated interpreter, while they may become friends, that they're not chosen only for friendship, and that interpreter and that deaf professional is able to meet that boundary and find a good place. So we provide scenarios and examples and say, this preferred interpreter that you have, let's talk about how would they handle this case. If a trauma came in, would you feel like you could rely on that interpreter to emotionally and professionally handle those scenarios? So I think having all people involved in that conversation really allows you to pick the best selection. And I could go on for days about this too, but I'm excited to hear what Jermaine and Julia have to say as well.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, you've got me thinking about Jermaine. Now, you schedule interpreters. So, how do you manage when a deaf student says, you know, I've got a preferred interpreter here, especially if maybe that interpreter isn't yet certified or you feel hesitant? How do you manage that preferred interpreter request? How do you make that call and decide to go ahead and place the interpreter or not? Would you mind responding?
Right. This is Jermaine. Number one thing at DAC is we focus on having certified interpreters only. I must say that with Deaf Action Center. Some certified interpreters aren't the greatest signers. They do have certification. And then there's other interpreters that are great signers, but they struggle to pass the test. And I'm sure we could all, like Alicia said, we could talk about this subject for days. But let me get right to the point. Bringing in a CDI, a certified deaf interpreter, is something we do. We also bring in DIs, deaf interpreters. And again, the reason for it is if a hearing interpreter makes that determination that the client needs a deaf interpreter or a certified interpreter, then that's the direction we headed. We have about 2 or 3 CDIs, and DIs, we have plenty. So there is an impact depending on whether a person has certification or not. And really, I'd have to say, for hearing interpreters, we have to have certified interpreters here. We also provide internship opportunities. For anything like that, it's important to ask and check in with the clients first. We do that. And we also ask our students, and sometimes they deny that, and sometimes they don't. Some students just don't want to deal with the logistics that go into having an extra person in the classroom and having all eyes on them. So we do ask a client's preference first. And we do use CDIs or DIs to provide employment opportunities for the deaf community. Also, it enhances their skills. Whether they be certified or non-certified, we are providing opportunities for them to use their skills, enhance their skills, and also gain valuable experience. And I'd have to say, yes, our agency focuses on providing certified interpreters, but we also go through a vetting process. We ask about philosophy. We ask about experience. We ask quite a bit before we hire an interpreter on to work with us. And yep, in a nutshell, I hope that answers your question.
It certainly does. You know, and it's so important to have, like you and Alicia both have mentioned, is input from everyone. Yes, the deaf student absolutely must be involved, get a sense of their preference and their needs. And then in addition to that, the school as well, of course, needs to be on board, at least have an understanding and know if there are limitations or what they need to know about what their goals are. Bring all of that to the table, and that really helps coordinate for success. Julia, do you have anything you'd like to add about your preferred interpreters? Yes, I do. I have a few situations, but before I give my experience, as a deaf interpreter, I'd like to respond to Alicia and Jermaine. So, first of all, I agree with what Alicia said when she mentioned the program at the school, and sometimes they just don't know what to do. It's their first experience. They've never yet met a deaf student. That happened to me more than once. I've gone into the university and I'm her, and I go in and I have to explain, hey, this is what I need. I require an ASL interpreter, and etc. in terms of my accommodations. And then, like I said, I walked in and they literally had no idea what to do. They just kind of looked back at me. And so I had to explain to them that they could also be referred to, now I'm saying RIT, but I don't think that's actually what I'm meaning to say. And this is Sarah. Is it RID you're referring to? Thank you, Sarah. That's exactly what I meant. RID, because they have a lengthy list of interpreters, and there's an agency there that can help us find interpreters in our area to make sure that we've got them available. And so I've done that in the past. They said that they would use the RID list and to try to find an agency in the area to help me with interpreting services. But as Alicia mentioned, you said that you go and talk to the deaf person and talk to the student, make sure that they, if they have a preferred interpreter, that they're used, ask, and you ask a lot of questions in terms of, do you feel like, and you said that you do a vetting process, and my goodness, I wish I had that, you know, where I, at school and the agency both, they'll ask me more questions, you know, to make sure that I get what I want, but I don't have the experience of them asking a lot about the interpreter. You know, it's almost like, you know, I'll go back to the disability services offices and say, now I put these names down of interpreters that I prefer that we use for my classes or whatever. And then I'll also give a list of backup interpreters in case, let's say my preferred interpreter is sick. I like for them to have a list of a backup interpreter that I also prefer. And then the disability office will tell me whether they can't, you know, sometimes they can't be guaranteed. So they do try to honor my request, and then they'll see how it goes with the scheduling of the interpreters, which I'm totally fine with. And then my preferred or required interpreters also ask me, they have in the past asked if they could bring an intern with them, an interpreter who's not yet certified, but they're still in the interpreting program and they're still a student and they need hours or credits in order to get their interpreting certification and to get through that program. And I always say, sure, no problem. And they can definitely come, but it is important that they let me know not only that the intern is coming and when they are coming. I need to be prepared mentally and physically to have that other person, because if that interpreter is not really just awesome and their ASL skills may not be all that just yet, I need to prepare myself for that in advance. You know, I think it's good for interpreters, and sometimes you can say, hey, this is a good class for you, maybe not a bad fit, but other classes maybe not such a good fit. And so that's a conversation to have with the interpreters. And I always give feedback to the interpreters, even if it's an intern. I don't mind giving feedback. I give them some tips, some tricks. I'll give them some advice. And also, you know, sometimes I'll even correct or critique them. You know, if they don't use the proper sign for a topic or a concept, I'll correct them. As we go along, I'll say, you know, use this sign or not this, or hey, do this some more. That worked well. That was effective. And so most interpreters really appreciate that when I do give the feedback, because, you know, it's something that benefits them, and they most often appreciate that. This is Sarah. For sure. Most of us as interpreters, we do appreciate that. But I have noticed, I've heard and seen some horror stories. I have deaf family and friends who the deaf person has said, hey, maybe not this sign this time. And the interpreter just loses it. Oh, my word, you told me I couldn't sign it. So again, for those of you interpreters in the audience today, it's so important. If you accept an assignment, whether it's in a school or whatever the setting is, please do check in from time to time, not just the first day. Hey, do you understand me? Are we good? And move on. That first day, do you have feedback? And then never ask again. That's not going to cut it. Make sure that you have an open mind and an open process, and include that deaf student or deaf client in your process. You know, and you can say, I can advocate for you or with you. What do we need to do different? Because I think it's so important that it's an ongoing, especially if it's a semester type course. So many students don't even want to do that, especially young students or their first time with an interpreter in a classroom. They're often shy about giving feedback, because in the K through 12 setting, it's also, you know, interpreters sort of are caretakers, or they are, quote, mothering them. So we need to be very mindful to empower the deaf students and take some of the accountability. We are the access team. We need to keep an open mind. This is Julia. I'd like to add another thing, if you don't mind. So when I work with an interpreter, most of the time, my interpreters will ask, for example, would you rather I stand or sit? Would you rather me sit or stand beside the teacher? So they ask a lot of placement questions. And then often, what I'll say is front of the classroom, somewhere up in there, and make sure you are next to the speaker. That way I can go visually between you and the teacher or professor who's speaking. And then if a student, let's say we're having a group discussion or something, then I'll tell the interpreter, I'll ask them if they don't mind coming into that space where I'm doing that group conversation, get next to the student who's speaking. So again, I have a visual line of sight between the interpreter and who's speaking at the moment. Or I'll say, hey, could you tell me who's speaking? Could you identify the speaker? If there's a person, and maybe they could even describe what they're wearing that day, or if they're behind me specifically, or if they sit in front of me. It could be that they're 2 rows behind me, 1 to the left. So I have them give me a little bit of environmental information as well. That way I can identify who's speaking, and I'm able to see them visually and put the name to the face, so to speak. And I don't want to be lost when someone's speaking. I want to know who's saying what. And so I ask my interpreters to be real specific about who's speaking and what sounds they're hearing. This is Sarah. Wow, such valuable information for sure. I love that. I have to let you all know that we are starting to run out of time. So I'm looking down here in the chat box. It seems that there are 2 questions that are awfully similar in terms of concept. So I'm going to pose these questions to you all. One hot topic is deaf interpreters. Now we have briefly touched on that already, but the question from the audience is they wonder, how are you able to convince the schools to bring in a deaf interpreter? Sometimes it's tough. Maybe the hearing interpreter wants one, is advocated for one. The deaf student agrees. They also want that. But the school says, no, we don't need that. What is a deaf interpreter for? It's unnecessary. So I wonder how you all convince them. Let's tap into some of those success stories in terms of how have you convinced the school or university to approve that. And then also with the preferred interpreter situation. Often there are staff interpreters involved, which is fantastic. It's consistent, right? We've talked about that. But like you mentioned, Jermaine, just because they're staff interpreters does not mean they're a good fit for every situation or every deaf student or client. So the same holds true. What do you say? How do you convince them? Okay, I understand you have staff. We appreciate that, but they are not qualified or not a good fit for this particular course. Let's say it's an automotive class, and this interpreter is absolutely clueless about that. We know this other interpreter who knows it incredibly thoroughly. They're very skilled in this space. So I have those 2 questions for you: deaf interpreters and preferred or specific interpreter. So how do you convince the people who are paying for and hiring these interpreters? How do you navigate that space? It's extra work, potentially extra fiscal responsibility. What do you say? How do you convince them? Julia? Well, from what I know, I don't have a lot of experiences with CDIs in an educational space. I would love one, but it would be for me as a student or an interpreter. Like if we are typing an essay together or something, or making an argument in terms of why we should, and then the argument as to whether we should hire a deaf interpreter. So I would refer them to an organization who is really good at explaining the purpose and benefit of a deaf interpreter and why a deaf interpreter is beneficial. There's just so much information out there. So I would refer them. And then after they've taken a look at that organization's information and get at least a grasp in terms of why deaf people need a deaf interpreter, and then they may be willing to bring them on campus. I think that's a good idea. But even after either they don't look at the information or they're still not convinced, what I would do at that point, I think I'd follow the policy and grievance process of who to speak to in the disabilities office who may be a supervisor or an administrative level. If that doesn't work, and file a complaint and ask them for some help, specifically if it's not following the ADA. I mean, that's important. And this is Sarah. You're referring to different references and agencies. Man, that's a great point to show that other people have information. Fortunately, National Deaf Center has recently developed a resource about deaf interpreters. So it's really good. And, you know, I feel like it could help that college or university or school when they see something that is coming from the national level, federally funded, research-based, evidence-based documentation. And there's plenty of other research out there, as you mentioned. Jermaine, I know you working at the Deaf Action Center, you all are well known for placing deaf interpreters at colleges and universities. How did you do it? I know there was a fight, so tell me about it. Would you share your secret sauce with the rest of us, please?
Yeah, we had to roll up our sleeves and get ready. It wasn't that tough, to be honest. But again, we have a wonderful supportive team. The coordinators at the universities as well, the departments at the universities as well. Everyone, every stakeholder came into play. Everyone was ready. We knew that it had to be done. Of course, an institute usually thinks of money first. It's about finance, right? They don't seem to understand what they're providing.
This is Julia. I've had that exact same problem at the university. That's all they think about. And I'm sorry to say, but oh my word. They don't, I wish they wouldn't think about the money. I'm like, I just need the interpreter. That's the important part of the conversation for me, not the money. Sorry. You were saying, Jermaine?
Julia, this is Jermaine. I agree with you 100%. No need to be sorry. It's a dollar issue, right? Some places also can't afford to provide those accommodations. They sometimes just don't understand how to prioritize the situation, which is the truth. But back to what I was saying, when the various stakeholders come together and we're ready to address these issues, we have broken down barriers in this sense. And I think when it comes to a deaf interpreter, hearing interpreter team, the argument is sometimes, well, it's two people in a room and they're consuming too much space. But that argument doesn't belong to the scheduler or the coordinator. They really just need to focus on providing services to their deaf students. Now at DAC, we have recently had 2 enrollment specialists, one that serves in the Dallas area and another that serves the Fort Worth area. And those 2 enrollment specialists just took a training workshop where there were college coordinators, I think over 50 college coordinators. Right, Sarah, I see your excitement. And so it was a huge step. And I think that the resource is going to make its way further and further out to other communities. And I believe that people will realize that the course puts an emphasis on listening to students' needs when it comes to DIs or CDIs. And even before this, I think about a year or 2 years ago, it was pre-COVID is what I can say. We were in a battle. It was a constant battle to be able to have DIs and CDIs in the classroom. And I think once the stakeholders understood the needs in these competitive courses, right? And saw the results that students were passing with good grades in these competitive courses, then they realized that they were satisfying the need. And instead of students having to rely so much on a hearing interpreter and getting frustrated to the point where they fail, and failing when it's not even their fault. So by having the interpreter speak out when a DI or CDI need is present, and we go ahead and coordinate that with the universities and put that together. And again, some professors might be hesitant about it, but it's not about them. It's about the student. We are looking to guarantee student success. We're here to empower the student so that they could have their success. And finances aren't an issue. That perspective is illegitimate because the value is in developing the deaf professional. And it's about changing the mindset and that perspective as well. CDIs and DIs are successful in the area. Unfortunately, just as we were developing that, the pandemic hit and things have been tough. They haven't been simple, especially with younger students who were unfamiliar with Zoom or unfamiliar with using technology. some folks just don't have those skills developed yet. So we still have been finding new ways to bring CDIs and hearing interpreters into a situation in various ways. And we've been getting better and better at that because we have to. There is no choice. The deaf student and having an interpreter that fits is primary to our situation. That's the primary goal.
And this is Sarah. Yeah, for sure. And hold on. I do want to let you all know we have 5 minutes left. And so, oh my gosh, I love to see such positive experiences with deaf interpreters. We have seen not only in Texas, but in other states, when a DI, a deaf interpreter, is brought into the classroom, the students' completion rates, graduation and success rates take off. Colleges and universities are floored. They love to see that information. And so we can hopefully find some more data, some numbers where DIs are there, and we can expand that to justify. Now, we do have some proof already, some evidence, and for sure colleges like to see that. And obviously, yes, money is an issue, but they also like to see graduation and completion rates. Alicia, did you want to add just one more thing real quick before we wrap here today?
Yeah, I just wanted to encourage educators and programs as they're looking at their bottom line to not always just consider the cheapest route, because we have many examples of a lot of legal cases being brought forward where it ends up costing the institution a lot more money in the long run because due diligence was not given to the process of hiring the appropriate interpreter. And they have to go back and they incur all these legal fees, and the student maybe doesn't graduate, and so and there's just many examples where it has failed. And also I want to encourage, and when I first started this work, I was all about the staff hiring designated interpreters as employees. And one thing I want to caution about that, while I still think that can be a good way, is it is a trial and error process. So even though you bring people together and you think you have the best match, that can still fail because could be new, there could be strain on the team, you don't know. So I encourage people to be careful in their selection. I encourage them to do probationary periods. And there's a lot of creative approaches that can really reduce the cost. It could be flat rate contracts. It could be, just looking at the overall picture, and you will be surprised how willing interpreters are, especially to solidify, their work and at a lower cost sometimes. So yeah, there's just lots of creative ways to handle this to reduce costs and have success.
This is Sarah. Thank you so much for that information. The creativity, the collaboration, both so critical, and keeping all of this deaf-centered and partnering with the deaf person. That's how we see success. We are down to 2 minutes left today, and I need the last minute to send a handful of information out to the audience. Julia, do you have one last thought before we go? I would like to add one more thing for the deaf students and the interpreter and coordinators. I'd like to say that I have personal experience advocating and fighting for myself. But it would be nice if the interpreters or the interpreter coordinators helped the deaf students in that fight and in that advocacy. If they could say, hey, we need these things in this space, and tell the disability office that, and regardless of their response, maybe they don't understand, maybe they say flat out no, but the interpreter or the interpreter coordinator, if you could help the student by speaking up and advocating on behalf of the deaf student and not just letting the deaf student take that whole responsibility and speaking up for themselves, please speak up on our behalf. And also to instructors, they don't often know what to do with interpreters. Speak up, interpreters. Say, this is not right, this is not effective. For example, if a professor says they want to put me and my interpreters in the back of the classroom, and the interpreter would at that moment have to speak up and say, no, this person is deaf. If it's me, for example, Julia is deaf. She needs to be down near the front, and so does her interpreter. And then, you know, and often then a professor wants to put me in the back because they think it's a distraction to the rest of the students with the interpreters up there. And at that point, an interpreter can speak up and say, no, not only does the deaf student have a right as a deaf person, this is what we need for effective communication. And then the disability office can also support that. And they can talk to the professor as well and say, no, we can't do that. And then often after that time, it turns out that I'm able to sit wherever I need to gain access to the class. So this is Sarah. You know, advocacy is a team effort. It is group work. It is not only on the deaf person. We know it's a balance. It's a balance of having the interpreter involved, not taking that power, absolutely not, but going together and facing it together as that team. Okay, believe it or not, we are out of time. So Arlene, if you wouldn't mind putting that last slide on the screen for me. So we always change the way we host these panels. So we do definitely listen to our participant feedback. Another thing is we will send a follow-up email that'll answer some of the questions that we know we didn't have an opportunity to address today. So we touched lightly on a handful of topics, and we'll address all of those questions in our email. If the panelists agree, we will also include their direct contact information. So that way, if you want to reach out directly to a panelist, you'll be able to reach out to them. I think all three of our panelists today have agreed to give us their information. Thank you so much for being here and your willingness to share and your open-mindedness. Now, finally, here at NDC, we are here for you. That's what we do. We're here to support you. And also something you may see there in the chat box is a link. You can email our help team. It's help@nationaldeafcenter.org. I always forget if it's .org or .com, but I'm here to tell you it's .org. I go to type it and that's when I forget. So anyway, that's our email address. We've also got a website, nationaldeafcenter.org. You can click there and get information. You can get a direct link to the help email and also see so many resources, our history, legal information. Maybe you're struggling with a college or university receiving services or a trade school. We can send case history, different information to help you advocate for yourself. So check our resources page online. We also have, if you click on the Learn tab, we've got free CEUs, even more of them there, and CRC hours for you all if you're interested. Some really great courses that we've developed are there online for you. And my favorite is it's a power, privilege, and oppression topic. I forget the exact name of the course, but we'll put a link in the chat. Maybe one of my coworkers can do that. It is fantastic. It is so powerful listening, watching deaf people tell their stories. And it's so important for interpreters, schedulers, and coordinators, DSS professionals to get this information. So again, I could keep on going. I am a few minutes over time, but I respect your time today. Thank you again to our panelists and everyone who attended today. Your stories were so valuable. Thank you so much. And also thank you to the interpreters and our CART provider today who provided captioning. Thank you so much. You all have a great day. Bye. Thank you. Have a great afternoon. Folks.